Okay, I am going to continue just to try and knock out a couple more of these C's here to get through this. So we have conditioning, classical, and operant. So this is going to go more into a psychological sort of thing. Two related approaches to learning, both based on the association of certain stimuli with particular responses. The concepts that form the basis of behaviorism. In classical or Pavlovian conditioning, pioneered by the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, an involuntary physiological, so physiological like the body, response is triggered by a previously unrelated stimulus. I think they're going to kind of explain this a little bit, so just bear with me for a moment. Operant or instrumental conditioning, associated primarily with the American psychologist B.F. Skinner, the inspiration for the name of the principal in The Simpsons, involves developing voluntary behavioral responses based on the perceived outcome of a given action. So let's get into what all that means. So Pavlov's development of classical conditioning grew out of his studies of digestion, when he observed that dogs who naturally salivate while eating would begin to salivate in anticipation at the sight or smell of food, or even upon seeing the food dish or hearing the feeders approach. This he called conditional reflex, a response that generalizes from a particular stimulus to the conditions associated with it. Through a mistranslation, conditional later became conditioned. Pavlov discovered that when an unconnected stimulus, such as a bell, was added, the dog would soon learn to associate the sound of the bell with the arrival of food, and the conditioned response, salivation, yeah, I said that right, could ultimately be elicited, elicited simply by ringing the bell. Dyslexia struck, and I actually didn't see that second I there, and it was throwing me. Elicited, Elicitted. I wasn't seeing that second I. Sorry. So in other words, it was normally if you think, okay, dinner time, you're not going to think dinner time and you hear a bell. Those are two unconnected things generally. But you can pair them. You can make one sort of condition of the other. So, you ring the bell and then you give the stimulus of, okay, here's the bowl, here's the food, pour the food, there you go. Over time, and if anything I've learned from especially my pug or other things like this, a very quick amount of time in some fashions, now all of a sudden there's an unconscious response of expectation when you ring the bell. Ring the bell, then now all the physical stuff that happens when you know you're about to eat, all the stuff you would see otherwise, now starts happening as a reflex. There are some things where, there's certain smells. You might smell something and it reminds you of something completely different. Like for some weird example, and this just must have happened, maybe some summer when I was like a really little kid. We used to have citronella candles to try and keep like the mosquitoes and bugs away. And then, I would eat Nestle Crunch bars because I'm a chocolate fiend even as a little kid. I eat dark chocolate now and I try and stay away from Nestle because they're a horrible, horrible company. And, I'm not going to sort of voting with my money with that because they're awful. The people running it are just awful. But even now, billion years later, when I smell citronella, I have this sort of urge to have a Nestle Crunch bar. Two completely different things. Nestle Crunch bar is sort of snack, candy sort of thing on its own. And citronella, a way to keep yourself away from, bugs chewing you up if you like to go outside for 5 minutes, especially in Northeast Ohio in certain times in the summer because it's just a swamp. But I had, so now there's this weird condition thing now with it, and I don't think about it. I don't think citronella. I remember that one time on July 4th when I had I don't think about it at all. I smell citronella, I immediately think Nestle Crunch bar. It's weird, I know, and especially since I haven't had that association in decades. But the thing with conditioning, they talk about extinction. And extinction means you've gotten rid of that response. So what they would do is they would stop ringing the bell and then give the food. But then they'd ring the bell later on and then measure the salivation when you rang the bell. And at first they would think ring the bell means food, salivate, because that's the conditioned reflex response with that. But over time, if you ring the bell and stop feeding afterwards, they stopped having that response. They realized that even on a physical level, that doesn't mean food anymore. It's just a bell. But if out of 10 times you rang the bell, 3, 4 times maybe even twice, you did give the food. Then that conditioned response took much, much, much more time for that extinction to happen. So my guess is that because in my mind I smell citronella, that makes me think of Nestle Crunch Bar. When I recognize that consciously, I'm reinforcing that conditioning, which is what I think is happening with that. But this also has now, so let's talk a little bit more in terms of a sort of a mental and safety sort of thing, especially now that we're, still kind of, they're easing some restrictions, but we're still kind of in a lockdown situation. A lot of things have been happening. This is one of the reasons why people in abusive situations stay in abusive situations. It's very easy to say, oh, they're hitting you, you need to leave. They're being crappy to you, you need to get out of there. However, this is where some of this conditioning now sort of screws up the wires emotionally and even intellectually in some things, because out of 10 interactions with person A, person B is in a negative state with them for maybe 7 of them. Those other 3 are maybe really, really good. And maybe they remind them of when out of 10 interactions with the person, maybe 9, if not 10, maybe, between 8 and 10 of those interactions were good. So it was mostly good. And it reminds them of that. So it's keeping that conditioning going on over time, even if it's an unhealthy thing. So operant conditioning is derived from many of the same principles as classical conditioning. The primary differences are that it involves voluntary behavioral responses, the operants, rather than automatic physiological reflexes, and is based on the mechanisms of reward and punishment and positive and negative reinforcement. The introduction of desirable stimuli, stuff you like, and the removal of unpleasant stimuli, stuff you don't. The classic model of operant conditioning is a so-called Skinner box, or, quote, operant chamber, a controlled environment in which an animal's behavior can be influenced by the introduction or removal of stimuli. For example, a pigeon can be conditioned, to peck at a certain switch if that action results in the appearance of a food pellet, the reward, the positive reinforcement, or if it causes the cessation of an electrical shock, the negative reinforcement, or if pecking at the wrong switch generates a shock, punishment. Similarly, behaviorists say human beings learn by developing conditioned responses to the desirable and adverse stimuli of their surroundings. A lot of times, desirable responses, it will actually, create certain, really, the good brain chemistry starts firing off. And sometimes that can fire off even if stuff isn't really healthy, like high fat, high sugar, high salt foods. A lot of nice little brain chemistry starts coming out in there too, even though they're not good for you. But then that sort of conditions, taste good, feel good, going to do with that. So this is sort of the thing with, it's fairly pervasive in our culture because, think of a paycheck. It's a positive reinforcement. You do a thing for X amount of time, you get this for it. School is grades, or moving on to right to the next grade or something like that too. Sometimes, a lot of times with school, it might be a subject that you enjoy, so it's nice to have a certain training with it. So you kind of get grades or feedback with the thing, and that training you get in a subject or skill that you want to learn, is nice because you're getting that, that the reinforcement cycle with that or something like that. So, either way, it can do, kind of move you along like, oh, good, bad, good, bad. Sometimes it's the I want I want to continue the good, or I want to end the bad, as opposed to, oh, this happens and this is bad, but I want to have something happen that's good. Sometimes it's a more sort of longer term thing with that as well. Now, I want to throw this point in there again. This sort of talk about, it's almost an if or a versus. Like most things, there is no real if or versus with it. A lot of the times it's a combination of both. Like my previous example with the citronella smell and the, Nestle Crunch bar or something like that. That could have been, now it's more sort of a mental thing. But, even when I was a kid, there could have been, almost like the dog, a salivation sort of thing. If you hear a certain sound, you might be from a certain neighborhood, where you hear gunshots, and it might just be. I had it one time with my old roommates. We were coming home. We used to work together too, and we were coming in, and the neighborhood was a little whatever. And one of my roommates and I had grown up in Lorraine. We heard gunshots before. We were like, oh, gunshots, okay, whatever. The other guy hadn't, and he was getting a certain anxiety response. He heard a noise. There was a physiological response that was going on, but it was also, the actions kind of resulting in a train thing. There wasn't the training for this, or it was like, oh well, I don't want to be in a place where now this negative association happens too. So there's a little bit of both. There was, there is um, there's research for both. And besides research, I think our own um, just experience tells both. There's research. There's even research with people. I'm going to get into that, and since I'm doing this for work, never mind. I'm not going to get into that. I want to really badly, but I'm gonna show some control and not make that example of things. Um, Sorry, sometimes I have to stop myself before I say something. Uh, oh boy. All right. So I would say it's a little bit of both. So moving on from that, also sort of a way that combines that together. Now we're talking about consciousness. Um, this is fairly deep subject with this. So I'm going to read this and just kind of go with this again. Something I'm going to try to not put too much of my own sort of perspective on. From the Latin, meaning literally knowledge of things together, a concept commonly invoked but imperfectly understood and contradictorily defined. Consciousness has been variously said to be what separates human from animals and what unites all creation, purely spiritual and purely physical, the basis of existence and non-existence. Investigation of consciousness has traditionally been the province of philosophy and psychology, but in recent years it has also been occupied researchers in neuroscience, information theory, and cybernetics. Among other things, this is also going to kind of go into a little bit of what we talked about before in terms of, sort of scientific conservatism, where people are conducting a lot of experiments that are rigorously scientific, meeting both criteria of validity and reliability, meeting criteria in terms of you know taking out biases and stuff like that, talking about consciousness as being sort of a fundamental thing, almost like the Force in Star Wars, versus It's just sort of created by the meat in our brains, and that's it. So John Locke may have been the first to make a noun from the adjective conscious or aware. For him, consciousness defined our capacity for introspection and awareness of our own thoughts. Until Freud's introduction of the theory of the unconscious, the field of psychology was founded on the investigation of the consciousness, or as William James put it, of, quote, consciousness as such, unquote, as opposed to mere sensory perception. So we have sensory perception, what you're getting in through your senses, your eye, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're smelling, what you're tasting, what you're feeling. Again, and then I think there's like three other ones: the vestibular, which is sort of your balance; proprioception, which is your awareness of yourself in space. And I'm forgetting, I think there's one more, and I forget what it is. And we're not even talking about sort of like ESP sort of stuff. We're talking about the actual sort of way you navigate and get in information from the outside world. James's image of a stream of consciousness in which experience is a ceaseless cumulative flow contrasted with the Lockean theories of mental atomism and associationism, in which perception is seen as a string of separate events and consciousness arises from their interconnection through association into complex ideas. So William James is consciousness is something that's always happening, and Locke's sort of thing was like, you're getting different sort of things happening, and your consciousness is sort of making you think in a way that's stringing them along more smoothly. Most theories of consciousness assume that it is identical to, or at least coexistent with, the waking state. Many recognize it as involving some interaction of perception and contemplation, serving as our connection to both the outside world and to our inner selves. Consciousness thus involves awareness on two levels: awareness of a mental or physical plane, I am tired, and the self-consciousness that allows us to reflect on the state, I wish I didn't have to work so hard, are the examples for that. So it's not only the fact that, oh, this is going on, but your ability to think about, oh, this is going on, and your ability to recognize that you're thinking about, oh, this is going on, would all be part of consciousness. Many metaphysical views of consciousness see it as the basic fact of human existence, the quality comprising all the attributes that divide us from animals, such as imagination, desire, and belief. Let me just double check something here. And one of the see also things is animism. Animism, as we talked about earlier, which is why I wanted to kind of bring it up, was that consciousness isn't just the purview of human beings, that it is a sort of fundamental thing in the universe, and trees and plants and other plants and even rocks and mountains and water and rain, all these other things have a type of consciousness. It might not be human-like. It's that sort of thing where scientists are like, oh, well, we found no life in the universe. Well, no life as we understand it to be. So no sort of consciousness as we understand it as human, but that doesn't mean that they're not. We just might not be able to perceive it. And in our culture here in the West, if it cannot be touched and measured, then it doesn't exist. Ideas about the source of consciousness range from the spiritual to the electromechanical. In Indian and other Eastern philosophies, consciousness is simply a property of everything that is, pervading and pervaded by all of reality. In the 20th century, the scientific study of consciousness has focused on the idea of the brain as a data processor. Behaviorists assert that consciousness doesn't exist, that the brain works only through stimulus and response. Consciousness, therefore, is a social convention used to describe the ways we respond to our actions. Modern cognitive psychology likewise discounts consciousness as such, viewing mental function largely as the processing of algorithms that determine our reaction to sensations, although it allows the validity of cognitive constructs such as meaning. So in other words, there is no meaning. There's no real meaning. There's no real consciousness. It's all brain stuff. Our brain is a computer, and there are certain sort of, like I said, algorithms or certain things sort of programmed into how we respond. And then we sort of perceive that or create meaning from that. Contemporary work in neurophysics and computer science tends to support the notion of the mind as essentially the world's most complex data processor. Researchers into artificial intelligence believe that many of the activities associated with human consciousness, even future planning, awareness of self, and the creation of language and images, which some animals do, can be performed by a sophisticated computer. Critics, however, object that computers are not capable of true subjectivity or intentionality, at least for now. I would also, I am going to put a little bit of my own sort of spin on this as well, because there is also an idea of, and this comes out of a lot of things, that even some quantum physics now, because they're talking about there's certain fundamental things of the universe. There's almost like a base code. I think it was S. James Gates was talking about, he found with his sort of quantum mechanical sort of theoretical research and mathematics that there was like a base code to quantum physics and reality, and it almost looks similar to like a binary base code. So we use ones and zeros in computers. This binary base code that actually looks a little bit like the base code used for like a search engine. So there's that. So quantum stuff kind of starts going kind of weird with it, but there's the idea of the brain isn't the generator of consciousness, the brain is the receiver of consciousness. So if we go with the idea again of consciousness being like the Force in Star Wars, our brain is what what sort of allows us to be able to be part of that and function with it. So, and then there are some people who are like, well, if someone has a traumatic brain injury, or there's some sort of congenital problem, some sort of physical thing in the brain leading to something with mental health, or the whole Phineas Gage with getting the railroad spike into his frontal lobe and it changed his personality, then that changes the person. Well, the response to that is usually, if I have a television or a radio, the stations that are playing are always playing. If I have the radio in my car, for instance, it has the antenna and all this other stuff. Regardless of whether or not my radio is on, those stations are still playing. And that sort of consciousness is a fundamental part of the universe, whether or not, my radio is on or not. Now, my radio in my car had some sort of wiring problem. So your brain can have a wiring problem. It might come from an accident, injury, might come from something that happened in terms of the genetics. It might be something epigenetic where you had the potentiality for that thing and your environment was such a way where it turned it on. Regardless, that now is going to change the way that you receive and are able to use that fundamental thing. But that doesn't change the fact that that thing is still there, and it's still part of you. It's still part, you still have the ability to kind of use it and turn it on. I mean, my signal's all screwed up all the time. I can only get a small handful of things, and they don't come in very well. And it doesn't matter, if it gets messed up if it's sunny, or if it's rainy, or if it's windy, or if it's cold, or it's warm, or it's night, or it's day. Or, I could be close to the radio station and can't get anything at all. And then, 5, 10 to 20 miles out, I get it. Beyond that, I don't get anything. It's weird. But that doesn't mean that now that thing that is consciousness doesn't exist anymore. So that is, the sort of the sort of other side to that there. So I'm going to leave that there because they both did kind of have a thing with each other here. Can try and put a lot of other stuff together as we go as well after that, but that's a couple more C's in there for you too.